Staff Sergeant Maria Santos sat alone at the corner table, methodically working through her meal while the mess hall buzzed with conversation around her. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the utilitarian space, where the smell of institutional food mixed with disinfectant and the constant hum of industrial refrigeration units. Her uniform bore no flashy insignia, no chest full of ribbons to announce her accomplishments. Just clean, pressed fatigues and the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. 5 recruits entered with the swagger that came from surviving basic training but having never faced real combat. Private Johnson led the group, his chest puffed out as he scanned the room for entertainment. His eyes landed on Maria, sitting quietly with her head down, focused on her food. To him, she looked like an easy target. A small woman, alone, minding her own business. Perfect. The recruits approached her table with predatory grins, their boots echoing against the linoleum floor. Other soldiers glanced up from their meals, sensing the shift in atmosphere but uncertain whether to intervene. Maria continued eating, though her peripheral vision tracked every movement, every gesture, every tell that revealed their intentions. Johnson slammed his tray down on her table, causing her water glass to jump. "Sauce," he said with mock concern, "you look awful lonely over here. Maybe you need some company from real soldiers." Maria looked up slowly, her dark eyes meeting his with the kind of calm that came from facing far worse than cafeteria bullies. She had learned long ago that the loudest voices usually belong to those with the least actual experience. Her voice was steady, almost gentle when she spoke. "I appreciate the offer, but I prefer to eat in peace." The other recruits laughed, emboldened by what they mistook for weakness. They began to circle her table like wolves, their body language becoming more aggressive with each passing moment. The mess hall grew quieter as other diners sensed the brewing confrontation. "Where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there?" Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem the most ordinary. Johnson leaned closer, his breath hot against her face. "What makes you think you get to choose, sweetheart? This is our table now." Maria set down her fork with deliberate precision, the small metallic sound somehow carrying more weight than Johnson's aggressive posturing. The recruit's confidence faltered for just a moment as he caught something in her eyes, a flicker of steel that suggested depths he couldn't fathom. But his pride and the presence of his audience quickly overrode any instinct for caution. Private Martinez, emboldened by Johnson's lead, grabbed the back of the empty chair across from Maria and dragged it closer with a scraping sound that made several nearby soldiers wince. He dropped into it uninvited, his elbows hitting the table with enough force to rattle the silverware. "Yeah, sweetheart," Martinez said, his voice dripping with false charm, "we just want to get to know you better. What unit are you with? Desk duty? Kitchen patrol?" The other 3 recruits spread out around the table, effectively boxing Maria in. Private Chen stood directly behind her chair, while Privates Williams and Thompson flanked her on either side. Their positioning was amateur but effective for intimidation purposes. What they didn't realize was that Maria had already calculated 3 different exit routes and assessed each of their dominant hands, stance preferences, and probable reaction times. Maria's voice remained steady, though something subtle had changed in her posture. Her shoulders had squared almost imperceptibly, and her weight had shifted forward onto the balls of her feet despite remaining seated. "I suggest you gentlemen return to your own table and finish your meal." Johnson laughed, a harsh sound that attracted more attention from the surrounding tables. Several senior enlisted personnel had begun to take notice, their conversations dying as they sensed the escalating tension. The mess hall's ambient noise dropped by several decibels as more heads turned toward the confrontation. "Oh, you suggest, do you?" Johnson's voice rose mockingly. "What are you going to do about it if we don't? File a complaint with your supervisor?" The recruits burst into laughter, their confidence growing with each passing moment. They had mistaken her calm demeanor for weakness, her quiet dignity for submission. It was a mistake that more experienced soldiers would never have made. Maria glanced around the table at each of them in turn, her assessment thorough and professional. Johnson, the leader, was all bluster with poor balance. Martinez had quick hands but telegraphed his movements. Chen was nervous, constantly shifting his weight. Williams kept favoring his right side, suggesting an old injury. Thompson was the wild card, quieter than the others but potentially more dangerous. Have you ever witnessed someone surprise everyone with hidden talents? Sometimes the most unassuming people carry the heaviest burdens and the deadliest skills. Johnson reached across the table and flicked Maria's water glass, sending droplets across her uniform. The disrespect was calculated and deliberate, designed to provoke a reaction that would justify further escalation. The water droplets rolled down Maria's sleeve, leaving dark stains on the green fabric. She watched them fall with the same detached interest she might show observing rain on a window. Around the mess hall, conversations had ceased entirely. The only sounds were the distant clatter of kitchen staff and the low hum of ventilation systems working overtime in the suddenly thick atmosphere. Johnson interpreted her lack of immediate reaction as victory. He leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smirk, gesturing to his companions like a conductor directing an orchestra of harassment. His voice carried across the now silent dining area. "Look at that, boys. Ice cold. No reaction at all. Maybe she really is made of stone." Martinez reached over and deliberately knocked her napkin to the floor, then made an exaggerated show of concern. "Oops," he said with mock sincerity, "clumsy me. Why don't you pick that up for us, soldier?" Maria's eyes followed the napkin's descent but she made no move to retrieve it. Her hands remained flat on the table, fingers splayed in a position that looked relaxed but would allow for instant movement if necessary. The recruits mistook her stillness for compliance, failing to recognize the coiled tension of a predator assessing the best moment to strike. From across the mess hall, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Something about the scene bothered him, though he couldn't quite place what. The woman seemed familiar, but he couldn't immediately place where he'd seen her before. There was something about her bearing, the way she held herself even while being harassed, that spoke of training far beyond standard infantry. Chen, growing bolder with each passing moment, placed his hand on the back of Maria's chair and leaned down close to her ear. His breath was hot and carried the scent of cheap cologne mixed with cafeteria coffee. "You know what I think? I think you're scared. I think you're sitting there trying to figure out how to get away without looking like a coward." Maria turned her head slightly, just enough to make eye contact with Chen. For a split second, he saw something in those dark eyes that made his blood run cold. It was the look of someone who had killed before and would kill again if necessary. The look of someone who had walked through hell and emerged harder than the flames that tried to consume her. But the moment passed so quickly that Chen convinced himself he had imagined it. His bravado returned as he straightened up, though something deep in his subconscious was screaming warnings he chose to ignore. Williams decided to escalate further, reaching across to grab Maria's identification tags. The metal chain caught the fluorescent light as he lifted it from her chest, squinting at the stamped information. "What's this say? Maria Santos. Sounds foreign to me. Where you from, Santos? You even supposed to be in our military?" The racial undertone wasn't lost on anyone within earshot. Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing that the situation had crossed from simple harassment into something more serious. The identification tags dangled from Williams' fingers like a trophy, catching the harsh fluorescent light as he turned them this way and that. Maria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first crack in her composed facade. Those tags represented more than just her name and blood type. They carried the weight of every mission, every brother and sister in arms she had fought beside, every oath she had sworn to defend. Thompson, sensing the shift in dynamics, moved closer to Maria's left side. His shadow fell across her plate as he positioned himself within arm's reach. The coordinated movement wasn't accidental. These recruits might be inexperienced in real combat, but they understood pack tactics well enough. "You didn't answer the question, Santos," Thompson said, his voice lower and more menacing than his companions. Williams asked where you're from. "In this man's army," when someone asks you a question, you give an answer. Maria's breathing remained steady, controlled, each inhalation measured and purposeful. Her pulse had quickened slightly, not from fear but from the anticipation that came before action. Her body was beginning to prepare itself for what her mind had already accepted as inevitable. Across the mess hall, Sergeant Rodriguez set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink that seemed to echo in the unnatural quiet. Recognition was beginning to dawn on his features as he studied Maria's profile more carefully. There was something about the way she held herself, the controlled stillness that reminded him of someone he had served with years ago. Someone who had earned a reputation that preceded her into every room. Johnson decided to up the ante, reaching across the table to flick Maria's forehead with his middle finger. The gesture was deliberately insulting, designed to provoke a reaction that would justify whatever came next. The sharp snap of his finger against her skin was audible in the silent mess hall. "Wake up, sweetheart. We're talking to you." Maria's head moved back slightly from the impact, but her eyes never left Johnson's face. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried an undertone that made several nearby soldiers unconsciously lean forward. "You have 5 seconds to return my tags and walk away." The recruits burst into laughter, the sound harsh and grating in the tense atmosphere. Martinez slapped the table hard enough to make the silverware jump. "Or what? You'll tell the teacher? File a sexual harassment complaint?" Williams held the dog tags higher, letting them swing back and forth like a pendulum. "Maybe we should take a closer look at these. See what kind of fairy tale stories you've got stamped on here." He squinted at the metal tags, his lips moving as he read the information pressed into the steel. His expression began to change as the words registered, confusion replacing mockery as he encountered abbreviations and codes that meant nothing to a basic infantryman but would be instantly recognizable to anyone with experience in special operations. Maria's countdown had begun in her head, though her expression remained unchanged. 5, 4, 3. Chen, oblivious to the shift in William's demeanor, decided to contribute his own escalation. He placed both hands on Maria's shoulders from behind, his grip firm and possessive. "Maybe she needs some motivation to be more social." 2, 1. Maria's internal countdown reached 0 just as Chen's grip tightened on her shoulders. Williams was still squinting at the dog tags, his brow furrowed as he tried to decipher the military abbreviations that were becoming increasingly familiar. The letters SOG were clearly visible, along with numbers and codes that spoke of classified operations and clearance levels far above his pay grade. "What's this mean?" Williams asked, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "SOG? And what's this number sequence?" Johnson, still riding high on his perceived dominance, snatched the tags from Williams' hands before he could read further. He held them up like a prize, the metal chain swinging as he examined them with the arrogance of someone who had never encountered anything beyond basic military structure. Probably some made-up commendation. You know how these support personnel like to dress up their paperwork to look important. But Sergeant Rodriguez had gone completely still across the room. The letters SOG had registered with crystal clarity, and suddenly every piece fell into place. Special Operations Group. The woman sitting calmly while being harassed by 5 recruits wasn't just any soldier. She was Maria Santos, and if she was who he thought she was, these boys were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. Rodriguez started moving toward the confrontation, but he knew he might already be too late. He had seen Maria in action before, years ago during a joint operation that was still classified at the highest levels. She had earned her reputation in places that didn't officially exist, doing things that never appeared in any after-action reports. Maria's voice cut through the laughter like a blade, still quiet but carrying an edge that made several seasoned soldiers at nearby tables unconsciously straighten in their seats. Last chance. Thompson, emboldened by Chen's physical contact with their victim, decided to join in. He reached down and grabbed Maria's left wrist, his fingers wrapping around the slim appendage with what he thought was controlling force. His grip was meant to keep her seated, to demonstrate their collective power over this lone woman who dared to resist their entertainment. That was his first mistake. His second was assuming that someone who remained calm under pressure was someone who couldn't handle pressure at all. What would you do if you were in this situation? Sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when to reveal who you really are. The mess hall had become a theater, with every eye focused on the drama unfolding at the corner table. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work, drawn by the unnatural silence that had fallen over what was usually a cacophony of conversation and clatter. The air itself seemed to vibrate with potential energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. Johnson leaned forward, Maria's dog tag still dangling from his fingers, his face close enough to hers that she could count the stubble on his chin. His breath carried the scent of arrogance mixed with institutional coffee. You know what your problem is, Santos? You don't know your place. But don't worry. We're going to teach you. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying in its efficiency. One moment Maria sat passively enduring their harassment, the next she was a weapon unleashed. Her left hand moved in a blur, breaking Thompson's grip on her wrist with a precise counter-rotation that sent him stumbling backward with a sharp cry of pain. The sound of his wrist bones grinding against each other was audible to those closest to the confrontation. Before Thompson could fully register what had happened, Maria was already in motion. Her chair shot backward, catching Chen in the solar plexus with enough force to double him over and send him gasping to the floor. The metal legs scraped against the linoleum like fingernails on a chalkboard, a sound that would haunt the witnesses for years to come. Johnson barely had time to register the sudden shift before Maria's right elbow connected with his sternum. The impact lifted him slightly off his feet and sent him crashing backward into Martinez, both men going down in a tangle of limbs and shocked expletives. The dog tags flew from Johnson's grasp, the metal chain catching the light as it arced through the air. Williams, who had been standing to Maria's right, tried to grab her from behind as she dealt with the others. It was like trying to capture smoke. She pivoted on her left foot, her right leg sweeping his ankles in a textbook takedown that sent him face first into the table edge. The impact split his lip and sent blood spattering across the institutional beige surface. The entire sequence had taken less than 10 seconds. Maria caught her dog tags as they fell, the familiar weight of the metal settling into her palm like an old friend returning home. Around her, 5 recruits lay in various stages of shock and pain, their earlier confidence evaporated like morning mist. The silence in the mess hall was absolute, broken only by Chen's labored breathing and Thompson's soft whimpering as he cradled his injured wrist. Sergeant Rodriguez had stopped in his tracks, his face a mixture of awe and recognition. He had seen Maria fight before, but never in such close quarters and never with such surgical precision. Each movement had been calculated, each strike designed to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. She could have killed any one of them, probably all of them, but she had shown restraint that spoke to a level of control that came only from years of the most demanding training. Thompson struggled to his feet, his face pale with pain and confusion. He looked at Maria as if seeing her for the first time, which in many ways he was. The quiet woman who had been eating alone was gone, replaced by someone whose very presence radiated danger. "Who are you?" he whispered, the question carrying across the silent mess hall like a prayer. Maria straightened her uniform with the same methodical precision she had shown while eating her meal. Her breathing was steady, controlled, showing no signs of exertion despite having just neutralized 5 opponents in rapid succession. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had earned her rank in the crucible of combat. Have you ever seen someone's true nature revealed in a moment of crisis? Sometimes we discover that the quiet ones have the loudest actions. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, she said simply, her words cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. The name hung in the air like a challenge, and suddenly Sergeant Rodriguez wasn't the only one who recognized it. Whispers began to ripple through the mess hall as soldiers connected the dots between the woman standing calmly among 5 defeated recruits and the legends they had heard in hushed conversations during late-night guard duties. Maria Santos. The ghost of Kandahar. The woman who had single-handedly held off an entire Taliban assault squad while calling in air support for her wounded team. The sniper who had made impossible shots in impossible conditions, whose confirmed kill count was classified but rumored to be in the triple digits. Johnson struggled to his knees, blood trickling from his nose where it had connected with the table during his fall. His earlier swagger had evaporated completely, replaced by the wide-eyed terror of someone who had just poked a sleeping dragon. He tried to speak but only managed a strangled croak. Martinez was having similar difficulties, his diaphragm still spasming from the chair impact. He looked up at Maria with the expression of a man who had just realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff in the dark. The casual confidence that had carried him into this confrontation had been shattered as completely as his breath. Chen remained on the floor, one hand pressed to his stomach while the other reached weakly toward his scattered meal tray. His face had gone gray with pain and shock, sweat beading on his forehead as he tried to process what had just happened. One moment he had been part of a pack, strong in numbers. The next he was prey that had been effortlessly swatted down. Williams sat slumped against the wall where he had landed after his encounter with the table edge, blood from his split lips staining his uniform shirt. His eyes tracked Maria's every movement with the hypervigilant attention of someone who had learned to fear what seemed harmless. Thompson was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I didn't know. We didn't know who you were." Maria's expression remained unchanged, neither angry nor satisfied. She had done what needed to be done with the same professional competence she brought to every task, whether it was eliminating enemy combatants or neutralizing mess hall bullies. "Ignorance isn't an excuse for disrespect," she said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Every soldier in this army has earned the right to eat their meal in peace, regardless of their rank or assignment." Across the mess hall, conversations resumed in hushed tones as soldiers processed what they had witnessed. Some pulled out their phones, trying to discreetly capture photos or video of the aftermath, though most were too stunned to think of documentation. They had just seen a master class in combat efficiency delivered with surgical precision. Rodriguez finally reached the scene, his approach respectful but purposeful. He had served with enough special operations personnel to understand the protocols, the unwritten rules that governed interactions with those who operated in the shadows. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said, his voice carrying the formal respect due to someone of her reputation. "Everything all right here? What experiences have shaped the people around you that you might never know about? Sometimes the most extraordinary stories belong to the most ordinary-looking people." Maria nodded once, a crisp acknowledgement that conveyed volumes about military bearing and mutual respect between professionals. "Everything's fine now, Sergeant," Maria replied, her tone professional but carrying an undertone that suggested the situation had been handled with appropriate force. She glanced down at the 5 recruits who were slowly attempting to regain their composure, her expression neither sympathetic nor vindictive. Rodriguez nodded, understanding the subtext. He had seen enough aftermath scenes to recognize when justice had been served efficiently and proportionally. His eyes swept over the recruits, taking in their various injuries and states of shock with the practiced assessment of a seasoned non-commissioned officer. Johnson finally managed to get to his feet, using the table for support as his legs wobbled beneath him. The blood had stopped flowing from his nose, but his shirt was stained and his pride was in tatters. When he looked at Maria now, it was with the fearful respect of someone who had learned a hard lesson about assumptions and consequences. "We're sorry," he managed to say, his voice thick with embarrassment and residual pain. "We didn't mean any disrespect." Maria's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained alert and ready. She had delivered the lesson these recruits needed, but she took no pleasure in their humiliation. Her response was measured, professional, the words of someone who understood that true strength lay in knowing when to use force and when to show mercy. "Disrespect is a choice, Private Johnson. So is respect. I suggest you think carefully about which one you choose going forward." Thompson struggled to his feet, still cradling his injured wrist. The pain was manageable, but the shame burned deeper than any physical wound. He had been part of a group that had targeted someone they perceived as weak, only to discover they had cornered a warrior whose capabilities exceeded their wildest imagination. Martinez and Chen were helping each other up, both moving gingerly as they tested their various bruises and strains. The casual camaraderie that had bonded them together as harassers had evaporated, replaced by the shared embarrassment of their spectacular miscalculation. Williams remained seated against the wall, dabbing at his split lip with a napkin someone had handed him. His eyes never left Maria's face, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of someone who had just redefined his understanding of what was possible. Around the mess hall, normal activity was slowly resuming, though the atmosphere remained charged with the aftermath of what everyone had witnessed. Soldiers returned to their meals and conversations, but their glances kept drifting back to the corner table where 5 recruits were learning what it meant to face consequences for their actions. Rodriguez cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the immediate situation. His voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years managing situations that required delicate handling. Perhaps it would be best if you gentlemen returned to your barracks and reflected on tonight's events. I'm sure you have some thinking to do about conduct and respect. The recruits needed no further encouragement. They began gathering their scattered belongings with movements that were careful and deliberate, each one acutely aware that they remained under the watchful eye of someone who had just demonstrated exactly how quickly situations could change. Johnson paused as he reached for his overturned tray, looking back at Maria with an expression that mixed fear with genuine remorse. "Thank you for not really hurting us." Maria's response was measured and deliberate, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the difference between necessary force and gratuitous violence. "I used exactly as much force as the situation required. Nothing more, nothing less." The recruits filed out of the mess hall in silence, their earlier swagger replaced by the careful movements of people who had learned to fear their own arrogance. Their departure left an odd vacuum in the dining area, as if the very air had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Rodriguez waited until the recruits were well out of earshot before turning back to Maria with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal admiration. He had served long enough to recognize true warriors, and he was looking at one now. "Staff Sergeant, if you don't mind me saying, that was a textbook demonstration of controlled force. Those boys learned more about respect in 30 seconds than they probably learned in all of basic training." Maria picked up her dog tags from where they had landed on the table, the metal warm from the fluorescent lights overhead. She slipped them back over her head, the familiar weight settling against her chest like a returned piece of her identity. The chain caught briefly on a collar tab before sliding into its proper position. "They're young," she said simply. "Young and stupid, but not beyond redemption. Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes." Around the mess hall, conversations had resumed their normal cadence, though Maria could sense the sideways glances and whispered speculation that would follow her for the next several days. Word would spread quickly through the base grapevine, and by morning everyone would know some version of what had happened here tonight. Rodriguez pulled out the chair that Martinez had vacated and sat down across from her, his posture respectful but relaxed. His next words were spoken quietly, meant for her ears alone. "I served with your unit in Afghanistan. 3rd Deployment, 2018. You probably don't remember me, but I was with the convoy you guided through that ambush near Ghazni. Saved a lot of lives that day." Maria studied his face more carefully, searching her memory for the connection. After a moment, recognition flickered in her eyes. She remembered the convoy, remembered the desperate radio calls for support, remembered spending 18 hours in an overwatch position picking off insurgents while air support was delayed by weather. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, the name coming back to her along with the memory of his voice on the radio, calm and professional even while under fire. "You were the vehicle commander in the lead Humvee. How's your shoulder?" Rodriguez rotated his left shoulder reflexively, a rueful smile crossing his features. "Still clicks when it rains, but it works fine. Better than it would have if you hadn't kept those RPG teams off our backs." Their shared memory created an instant bond, the kind of connection that could only exist between soldiers who had faced death together and emerged stronger for the experience. It was a brotherhood that transcended rank and unit, built on mutual trust and proven competence under the most demanding circumstances. The mess hall continued its evening routine around them, but for Maria and Rodriguez, the present moment had become a bridge to shared experiences that most people would never understand. They had both walked through valleys where death waited behind every rock and tree, and they had both emerged with stories that would never appear in official records. Maria's expression warmed at the memory, though her eyes carried the weight of everything that had happened in that desert landscape years ago. She remembered Rodriguez now, remembered his voice crackling over the radio as insurgent fire intensified around his position. She had been perched on a rocky outcrop nearly a mile away, her rifle scope tracking movement through the heat shimmer of the Afghan afternoon. "You held that convoy together when everything went sideways," she said, giving credit where it was due. "Kept your people calm while I worked the problem from Overwatch. That takes real leadership." Rodriguez shook his head, the gesture dismissive but appreciative. "You took out 7 confirmed hostiles in 18 hours. 7. Some of those shots were over 800 meters in crosswind conditions. I've never seen shooting like that before or since." The conversation had drawn the attention of nearby tables, though the soldiers were discreet enough to avoid obvious eavesdropping. Word was already spreading through the mess hall in the way that military gossip traveled, carried on meaningful glances and subtle gestures between those who understood the significance of what they had witnessed. Maria picked at her now cold meal, her appetite diminished by the combination of adrenaline aftermath and unwanted attention. She had never been comfortable with recognition, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves without fanfare or ceremony. "Those boys tonight," Rodriguez said, nodding toward the exit where the recruits had disappeared. "They have no idea how lucky they are. Someone with your skill set could have put them all in the hospital without breaking a sweat." Maria's response was immediate and firm. "That's not who I am, Sergeant. I signed up to protect people, not to hurt them unnecessarily. Those recruits made a mistake, but they're still our people. They deserved a lesson, not a beating." The distinction was important to her, part of the code that had guided her through multiple deployments and countless life-or-death decisions. Power without restraint was tyranny, and she had seen enough real tyrants in war zones to understand the difference. Rodriguez nodded with the understanding of someone who had wrestled with similar questions about force and restraint. The best warriors, he knew, were those who fought not because they enjoyed violence but because they understood the cost of allowing evil to go unchallenged. From across the mess hall, Colonel Patricia Hayes entered through the main doors, her presence immediately noticeable to anyone paying attention to military protocol. Her uniform was immaculate, her bearing that of someone accustomed to command, and her eyes swept the dining area with the practiced assessment of a leader who understood her environment. She had received word of the incident within minutes of its conclusion, as was standard procedure for any altercation involving multiple personnel. Her decision to investigate personally rather than sending a subordinate spoke to her understanding that some situations required command-level attention. What happens when someone finally recognizes the heroes who walk quietly among us? Sometimes the most powerful moments come when past and present collide. Hayes approached their table with measured steps, her expression neutral but alert. Rodriguez immediately began to rise, recognizing the approach of superior rank. "As you were, Sergeant," Colonel Hayes said, her voice carrying the authority of command but lacking any hint of reproach. Rodriguez settled back into his chair, though his posture remained respectfully attentive. Hayes turned her attention to Maria, and recognition flickered across her features almost immediately. She had studied enough personnel files and after-action reports to know exactly who she was looking at, though seeing the legend in person was something entirely different. "Staff Sergeant Santos," the colonel said, her tone shifting to one of professional respect tinged with genuine admiration. "I've read your file. Multiple deployments with Special Operations Group, Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart. The Ghazni Province operation alone saved 43 American lives." Maria straightened slightly in her chair, uncomfortable with the public recitation of her service record. She had never sought recognition for doing what she considered her duty, and having her achievements announced in a crowded mess hall felt like a violation of the privacy she valued. "Ma'am, with respect, those operations were classified," Maria said carefully, her words chosen to acknowledge the colonel's authority while protecting sensitive information. Hayes smiled, an expression that conveyed understanding rather than dismissal. "Some things have been declassified, Staff Sergeant. The American people deserve to know that heroes like you have been protecting them, even if they can't know all the details." The mess hall had grown quieter as more soldiers became aware that a colonel was conducting what appeared to be an official conversation at one of their tables. The ambient noise level dropped as conversations paused and attention focused on the unfolding drama. Rodriguez found himself in the unique position of being witness to a moment of military history, watching as a field-grade officer publicly acknowledged the service of someone whose contributions had largely remained in the shadows. He understood the significance of what was happening, the way that recognition could transform not just individuals but entire units. "I understand there was an incident here tonight," Hayes continued, her voice carrying clearly in the now quiet dining area. 5 recruits who failed to show proper respect to a fellow soldier." Maria's jaw tightened slightly. She had hoped the situation could be resolved quietly, without drawing command attention or creating a spectacle that might reflect poorly on the recruits involved. Her instinct was always to protect her fellow soldiers, even those who had wronged her. "The situation has been resolved, ma'am," she said diplomatically. "No permanent harm was done, and I believe the individuals involved have learned from their experience." Hayes nodded, understanding the subtext. Maria was protecting the recruits from potential disciplinary action, showing the same loyalty to her fellow soldiers that had made her legendary in combat zones around the world. "I'm sure they have," the colonel agreed. "But this incident highlights something important that everyone in this dining facility should understand. Share this moment with someone who needs to understand that heroes come in all forms and that respect should never be based on assumptions." Hayes raised her voice slightly, ensuring that every person in the mess hall could hear her next words clearly. "Every soldier in this room needs to understand something fundamental about respect and recognition." Hayes' voice carried to every corner of the mess hall, commanding attention with the natural authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. The dining area had become completely silent now, every conversation suspended as soldiers turned to face their commanding officer. Forks paused midway to mouths, coffee cups remained suspended in hands, and even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to listen. The woman sitting at this table is Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, and she represents the very best of what it means to serve your country with honor and distinction. She has spent the last 8 years in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, protecting American lives and American interests with a level of skill and dedication that most of us can only aspire to achieve. Maria's discomfort was visible now, her shoulders tense as she found herself the unwilling center of attention. This was not how she wanted to be recognized, not as a spectacle in a mess hall full of strangers and acquaintances. But Hayes continued, her words carrying the weight of official recognition. "Tonight, 5 recruits made the mistake of judging this warrior based on her quiet demeanor and modest bearing. They assumed that someone who ate alone and minded her own business was somehow weak or vulnerable. They could not have been more wrong." Murmurs rippled through the assembled soldiers, a mixture of respect and embarrassment as they realized how close they might have come to making similar assumptions. Many had noticed Maria over the previous weeks, seen her eating alone or walking quietly between buildings, and had simply dismissed her as another support soldier going about routine duties. Staff Sergeant Santos neutralized all 5 harassers in less than 30 seconds, using only the minimum force necessary to end the confrontation. She could have seriously injured them. She could have humiliated them beyond recovery. Instead, she chose restraint and mercy, demonstrating the same judgment under pressure that has made her one of the most decorated soldiers in special operations. Rodriguez watched Maria's face as the colonel spoke, seeing the mix of pride and discomfort that came with unwanted public recognition. He understood her position, having served with enough quiet professionals to know that the best warriors rarely sought the spotlight. "The lesson here is simple but crucial," Hayes continued, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces turned toward her. "Never judge your fellow soldiers by appearances. Never assume that quiet means weak, or that humble means incapable. The person sitting next to you might be someone who has walked through hell and emerged stronger for the experience. Hayes turned back to Maria, her expression softening with genuine respect. Staff Sergeant Santos, on behalf of this entire command, I want to thank you for your service and for handling tonight's situation with the professionalism and restraint that exemplifies the best traditions of the United States Army. The mess hall erupted in spontaneous applause, the sound echoing off the walls as 200 soldiers rose to their feet in recognition of someone who had finally received the respect she had always deserved but never demanded. This reminds us all that extraordinary people walk among us every day, often unrecognized and unappreciated until moments like these reveal their true worth.